The war had ended, but the noise inside her mind had not. The young Japanese woman, a former army nurse, sat on the cracked earth, her uniform torn, her Red Cross band barely visible through the dirt and ash. Around her, dozens of captured women stared blankly at the horizon, too numb to cry, too proud to beg. They had been told this moment would never come. That capture was worse than death. If you are taken, their commanders warned, you bring shame to your ancestors. So when the sound of American engines roared through the jungle air, the women clutched each other's hands and whispered silent prayers for a swift death. The trucks stopped and outstepped men in khaki, dusty, exhausted, their eyes hollow from months of fighting. They did not shout. They did not raise their rifles. Instead, they simply looked. For the first time, the women saw not monsters, but men, human, scarred, weary. One soldier, barely 22, noticed the nurse sitting apart from the others, her arm bandaged with her own torn sleeve. He approached slowly, his canteen swinging at his side. When their eyes met, she froze, expecting cruelty. Instead, he spoke softly. "You deserve better." The words seemed impossible, like hearing the enemy speak poetry. She blinked, unsure if she had misheard. Better? The syllables rolled through her mind like water through cracked stone. All her life, she had been told she was a tool for the emperor, not someone who deserved anything. When the soldier gestured toward a tent, she hesitated. Her body screamed to run, but her legs refused to move. Another soldier came forward, gently helping her stand. Their touch was firm, but not cruel. Step by step, she walked into captivity, but nothing about it felt like the death she'd been promised. Inside the camp, there were tents, not cages. Smoke rose from a field kitchen. The air smelled of something she had not known in months: food. Steam curled above large metal pots as medics passed bowls down a line. She watched in disbelief as captured women were handed blankets, medical care, and warm soup. The scene was so ordinary it felt supernatural. She flinched when a soldier approached her with a bowl, expecting mockery. But his voice was calm. "Eat," he said. "It's still hot." Her fingers trembled as she took it. The soup was thin and pale, yet to her it smelled like life itself. For a moment she only stared at it, torn between shame and hunger. Then her stomach won. The first sip burned her tongue. Salt, broth, something like meat. She swallowed, and tears began to fall before she even realized it. Around her, the others began to eat too, cautiously, silently, some shaking so hard they spilled it. One woman sobbed as she chewed, another murmured a prayer. The sound of spoons clinking against metal bowls became the strangest song she'd ever heard. A song of disbelief. She looked up through her tears and saw that same soldier. The one who had spoken those impossible words. He was sitting with the other guards, eating the same meal. No special food, no cruelty, just a shared hunger. He laughed softly at something another soldier said. A small, human laugh. That sound pierced her like shrapnel, not from pain, but from confusion. Enemies weren't supposed to laugh like that. Not near her. Not with kindness still lingering in their tone. For the first time, she saw the enemy not as a monster, but as a man. Her spoon stopped midair. The war that had shaped her life, the war that had defined her honor, suddenly felt fragile. She didn't understand this new world, but she knew one thing. The moment he said, "You deserve better," something inside her began to crumble. That night, as the sky dimmed and the camp fell quiet, she would lie awake staring at the ceiling of her tent, her stomach full for the first time in months. The words echoed endlessly in her head. "You deserve better." And for reasons she couldn't explain, they hurt more than any wound. The camp quieted as night fell. the distant jungle alive with the hum of unseen creatures. The women sat together in silence, their bowls empty, their minds overflowing. No one dared speak aloud what they all felt, the confusion of being treated as something human. A medic moved through the tents with a lantern, checking wounds. When he reached the nurse, she flinched instinctively. But his tone was calm, almost gentle. "You'll heal fast," he said, tightening the clean bandage on her arm. "No more bleeding." She didn't understand the words, but the warmth in his voice translated easily. When he left, she stared at her arm, at the bright white cloth against her bruised skin. The contrast felt symbolic. For years, her pain had been invisible, swallowed by duty. Now it was being seen, cared for. The realization terrified her. Around her, others were adjusting to their strange new reality. Some sat on wooden bunks, clutching blankets like treasures. Others whispered to each other, wondering when the cruelty would begin. A few refused to lie down at all, convinced that sleep would invite punishment. The nurse lay back cautiously. The mattress creaked beneath her, thin, rough, but soft enough to feel like sin. She stared at the roof beams, counting the shadows that danced with the lantern light. Her mind screamed that this was deception. Her body whispered that it was peace. For the first time in years, there were no shouted orders, no whistles, no drills, no officers barking commands. The absence of noise was its own shock. She felt weightless, as if someone had untied the invisible rope around her chest that had been tightening since the war began. Outside, an American guard sat by a small fire, humming quietly to himself. The melody drifted into the tents, soft, unfamiliar, almost sorrowful. It wasn't a victory song. It sounded like something sung for the dead. The women listened in silence, unsure whether to be comforted or haunted. The nurse turned on her side and pulled the blanket up to her chin. It smelled faintly of detergent, something she hadn't smelled since her childhood home in Yokohama. Her eyes began to sting. She wasn't sure if it was from the smoke or from memory. Across the tent, another woman whispered, "They're kind." A third answered bitterly, "For now." The words floated like ghosts, mixing with the hum of the night. No one knew which version to believe. The nurse wanted to speak, to say that maybe kindness didn't need to be a trick. But the fear of dishonor still gripped her throat. To believe in mercy from an enemy felt like betrayal, not of her nation, but of everything she'd been taught to be proud of. Her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket again. She remembered her commanding officer's final words before capture. Death before disgrace. Yet here she was, alive, warm, breathing. Was that truly disgrace or survival? Her heart beat faster with every thought. The rules that had defined her world, loyalty, sacrifice, obedience, suddenly felt paper-thin. She didn't know what honor meant anymore. She only knew that dying for an idea now seemed far less noble than living for the chance to feel human again. The fire outside dimmed. The guards spoke quietly, one of them laughing at something trivial. The sound of laughter, carried by the wind, reached the tent. It was so ordinary, so peaceful, that for the first time, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Sleep came slowly, uncertainly. But when it did, it came without orders, without fear. That night, the war inside her began to lose its command. Morning light crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, soft and golden. The nurse opened her eyes, startled by how deeply she had slept. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The air was cool. There were no orders, no sirens, no explosions, only the faint smell of smoke. And something else, something warm and rich. She sat up, clutching her blanket. A voice outside called in English, calm, rhythmic, Nothing like the thunderous Japanese commands she was used to. The words she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. "It's time to eat." The women hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. One by one, they emerged from the tents, blinking against the morning light. Their faces were pale, their hair unkempt, their movements stiff. The nurse followed, her bare feet brushing against dew-covered grass. Ahead, smoke rose from the camp kitchen. A long table had been set up, trays neatly arranged in rows. American soldiers served from steaming pots, eggs, bread, and something that smelled unlike anything the women had ever known: coffee. The sight froze them where they stood. The nurse whispered, "For us?" Her voice trembled. No one answered. The guards didn't laugh, didn't mock. They simply gestured politely for the women to step forward. Confusion rippled through the group like a cold wind. She clutched her stomach as it growled audibly. The shame of hunger burned through her pride. A soldier noticed and smiled faintly, not with pity but with understanding, before placing a tray in her hands. Eggs, bread, coffee. She could barely breathe. The first sip of coffee shocked her senses. It was bitter, strange, almost painful. But it was real. She coughed, startled, and the American serving her chuckled softly, shaking his head. That tiny sound, the laugh of someone unarmed by hate, felt heavier than any sermon she'd ever heard. Around her, the others began to eat. Some sat in silence, eyes wide. Others devoured the food with quiet desperation, trying to hide tears behind their hands. One woman let out a nervous laugh and immediately covered her mouth, expecting to be punished. But no reprimand came, only the faint murmur of another soldier saying something kind. The nurse tasted the bread. It was soft, sweet, and warm against her teeth. Her body trembled with gratitude she didn't know how to express. This wasn't just a meal. It was proof that the world she'd been told existed, one divided between noble warriors and savage enemies, had been a lie. As she looked around, she saw a strange sight: guards and prisoners eating side by side, not as equals, but as something close. The Americans didn't hover over them. They didn't bark orders. They simply ate their own breakfasts, talking quietly, laughing about the weather. It was unbearable in its simplicity. The women, once soldiers of an empire, had been stripped of everything except their humanity. And here that humanity was being handed back to them with a plate of eggs and a cup of bitter coffee. The nurse's hands shook as she lifted the mug again. In its reflection, she saw her own face, thinner, older, but alive. She realized she had forgotten what her own eyes looked like when they weren't filled with fear. The laughter of the guards drifted over again. Not cruel, just ordinary. It felt like the sound of another world, one she had never been allowed to imagine. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered to herself, "Maybe I do deserve better." The words tasted strange in her mouth, like a forbidden prayer. But as she swallowed the last of her coffee, the bitterness no longer stung. It felt like truth. The days in the camp began to fall into rhythm, a rhythm that terrified and comforted in equal measure. Wake at dawn, line up for breakfast, clean the tents, rest, no punishments, no drills, no screams. The monotony of peace was something none of them knew how to live with. The nurse found herself helping the medics, not by order, but by habit. She cleaned instruments, organized bandages, and translated gestures between the wounded and the women who could still stand. The Americans didn't stop her. In fact, they seemed grateful. It was strange, she thought, to be useful without being commanded. One afternoon, an officer arrived, not with weapons, but with a box of paper and pencils. He spoke through an interpreter. "You may write to your families," he said. We will send your letters to Japan through the Red Cross. The room went silent. For several seconds, no one moved. The idea was too absurd to believe. Letters? To home? It had to be a trick. One woman whispered, "They want us to write lies." Another said, "They'll laugh at what we write." But the officer simply placed the paper on the table and walked away. The nurse stared at the blank page for a long time. Her hand shook. What could she possibly say to her mother that she was alive? That her captors fed her, clothed her, treated her like a person? How could she explain that captivity had given her more dignity than the empire ever had? Slowly she began to write. The words came haltingly, uncertainly. "Mother, I am alive. They treat us kindly. I do not understand this war anymore." Her tears fell onto the page, smearing the ink. It was not a letter of confession. It was a letter of awakening. Around her, others wrote too. Some wept as they scribbled. Some smiled faintly as memories returned. Childhood homes, siblings, faces blurred by time. The sound of pencil scratching filled the room, soft and steady, like rain on canvas. When the soldiers came to collect the letters, they handled them with surprising care. The interpreter said, "They will be sent soon." None of the women truly believed it, but for a few minutes they allowed themselves to imagine their families reading those words. That night, the nurse lay awake again, her letter folded beneath her pillow. She imagined her mother opening it, gasping at the impossible message, that her daughter, a captured Japanese nurse, was being treated with compassion by the enemy. She wondered if the letter would even reach home, or if it would be confiscated and burned. But she didn't care. Writing it had already changed something inside her. For the first time, she had spoken truth without fear of punishment. Across the camp, other women shared the same quiet transformation. They began to talk, not about the war, but about what came after. One dreamed of opening a clinic. Another wanted to see the ocean again. They were no longer thinking of death. They were planning for life. The guards noticed the change too. They stopped watching with suspicion and began greeting the women as they passed. A nod here, a word there. Humanity was contagious. The nurse, sitting beneath the fading evening light, whispered the same words that had haunted her since the first day. "You deserve better." Only now, for the first time, she said them not as a question, but as a truth. In the stillness that followed, she realized something profound. The war might have taken everything, her country, her rank, her purpose, but here, behind barbed wire, she had found something the empire had never given her: the right to feel human. The weeks began to blend together, like pages turning in a book no one expected to read. The camp, once foreign and terrifying, had become something else: quiet, predictable, almost peaceful. The nurse sometimes forgot she was a prisoner. Sometimes she even caught herself smiling. And every time she did, guilt followed close behind. One morning, the air was heavy with the smell of damp soil after a night of rain. The nurse was helping the medics when a soldier approached with a small paper pouch. He pointed to a patch of earth near the fence and, through gestures, told her to plant them. She didn't understand why. He only said one word slowly, carefully: grow. Inside the pouch were seeds, small, ordinary, meaningless at first glance, but when she knelt down and pressed her fingers into the soft ground, something stirred in her chest. It had been so long since she'd touched the earth for anything but survival. To plant something felt defiant. The other women gathered around curiously. "Why are we doing this?" one asked. The nurse only shook her head. She didn't know. But she pressed each seed into the dirt, covered it gently, and whispered without thinking, "Live." The women laughed softly, not mockingly, but in wonder. Days passed. The seeds became a ritual. Every morning, after breakfast, she would check the soil, kneeling in the same place, brushing away dew. The guards began to notice. Some would nod, others would bring her water. The act was simple, but in a place meant to remind them of captivity, it became something sacred. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, she saw it, a single green sprout pushing through the soil. Tiny, fragile, yet impossibly alive. Her breath caught in her throat. Around her, the others gasped. For a moment, the camp wasn't a prison. It was a garden. The women began tending it together, watering, clearing pebbles, protecting it from wind. They gave it names and whispers. Hope, one said. Freedom, another added. The nurse smiled and said nothing, but inside she thought of something deeper, forgiveness. The Americans watched from a distance. They didn't interfere. Perhaps they understood what that small patch of green meant. It wasn't about food. It was about proof. Proof that life could grow even in soil poisoned by war. That night, as the women sat under the fading sky, the nurse stared at her hands. The same hands that once dressed wounds, that once obeyed orders to serve an empire without question. Now those hands had given life, and she couldn't help but wonder if the same could happen inside her, if something new could grow where loyalty once choked everything else. Across the camp, laughter drifted from the guards' fire. Someone played a harmonica, the soft notes winding through the quiet. For the first time, the sound didn't sting her. It felt human. She realized that the garden wasn't just growing in the dirt. It was growing between enemies. The women began to change in small, invisible ways. They stood taller. They talked more. They smiled without fear of reprimand. The nurse noticed how their eyes, once hollow, now reflected sunlight instead of despair. Captivity had become a mirror, showing them who they might have been all along. When she checked the plants again, now taller and greener, she found something left beside them, a single folded note, written in careful handwriting. Beauty can live anywhere. She didn't know which soldier had written it, but she didn't need to. She touched the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. For the first time since she'd taken her oath to serve the Empire, she allowed herself to believe that mercy was not weakness, and that compassion, once planted, could not be uprooted. The next morning, when she awoke to the sight of green pushing through brown, she whispered to herself the words that once haunted her. You deserve better. But now, they didn't feel foreign. They felt earned. The camp had changed. Where fear once ruled, routine now reigned, quiet, steady, human. Yet there was one thing the nurse still couldn't shake, the silence that lingered after dark. It wasn't threatening anymore, but it felt hollow, as though the air itself carried ghosts. One evening, while she was washing utensils near the mess tent, she heard something she hadn't heard since before the war, a piano. The notes were hesitant at first, uneven, as though the player was afraid to let them live. Then, slowly, the melody began to form, soft, sad, but beautiful. The sound drifted across the camp, over the barbed wire, through the rows of tents. The women froze where they stood. Some turned toward the source, others simply closed their eyes. For a moment, time stopped. Music, something forbidden in war, something human, had crossed enemy lines. The nurse followed the sound. Near the recreation tent, a young American soldier sat at an old upright piano, his sleeves rolled up, his face caught between weariness and peace. He played as though he were somewhere far away. A few guards stood nearby, listening quietly. Without realizing it, the nurse stepped closer. The notes reminded her of home, of festivals, of laughter echoing through wooden streets, of the songs her mother used to hum while hanging laundry. The melody wasn't Japanese, yet something in it felt familiar, like memory itself had learned a new accent. She wasn't alone. Dozens of women stood behind her now, drawn by the sound. The guards didn't stop them. No one spoke. The piano became a bridge no politics could burn. When the song ended, silence fell, not out of fear, but reverence. Then quietly, the nurse did something she hadn't done since the war began. She sang. The tune was simple, a lullaby from her childhood. Her voice trembled, but it carried. The camp stilled again, as if the world was listening. The soldier at the piano looked up, surprised, then smiled, that same soft, tired smile the nurse had seen before. He began to play along, his chords blending with her voice. It was awkward at first, then seamless. Two worlds meeting on the same key. When she finished, there was no applause, just quiet breathing, shared among former enemies who had, for a few minutes, become an audience. The nurse lowered her head, embarrassed, but the soldier said gently, "Beautiful." She didn't know the word, but she knew the tone. That night, the camp was different. Laughter came easier. The air felt lighter. Even the guards seemed softer, more patient. The piano returned every evening after that, and sometimes playing, sometimes waiting, its wooden frame glowing faintly under the lantern light. The nurse began to hum as she worked, small melodies that blended with the rhythm of daily chores. The others joined in. It wasn't rebellion. It was something more powerful. It was remembrance. They were remembering what it meant to feel alive. One afternoon, she asked an interpreter what the Americans called the song the soldier had played. He said, "It's called home." The word struck her harder than any sermon. Home. A place beyond barbed wire, beyond duty, beyond the ashes of war. That night, as the piano played again, she whispered the word to herself. Home. Not Japan. Not the Empire. Just the idea of a place where kindness wasn't treason. She realized then that freedom wasn't always a door without bars. Sometimes it was a sound that reminded you you were still human. And for the first time, when the music faded, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like someone waiting to be reborn. The piano still lingered in the air even when it wasn't playing. It had become part of the camp's heartbeat, a reminder that life somehow had returned to a place built for the opposite. But change often arrives in small, unexpected gestures. And one morning, it came in the form of a camera. The Americans had a photographer, a young man with dark hair, his uniform sleeves rolled up, a small box slung over his shoulder. He wandered the camp quietly, taking pictures of repairs, gardens, and sometimes the prisoners themselves. The women tried to avoid him, turning away whenever the lens pointed their way. They had been taught that shame should never be captured. The nurse felt it too. That instinct to hide. In the Empire's world, a woman's face was not her own. It belonged to duty. Her image was to be erased, never remembered. But when the photographer smiled and raised the camera gently, not like a weapon, but like a question, something in her softened. He gestured toward the small garden she had planted weeks earlier, the one now blooming with fragile green leaves. "You," he said, then pointed to the plants. "Here." She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the intent. He wanted to take a picture, not of a prisoner, but of the gardener. She hesitated, brushing the dirt from her hands, her heart pounding. The other women watched silently, unsure whether this was kindness or cruelty. But the man's face was calm, patient. He waited, not ordering, simply offering. Finally, she nodded. She knelt beside the plants, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes downcast. The photographer lowered the camera slightly and said something else, softer this time. The interpreter nearby whispered, "He said, look up." The word struck her. Look up. 2 small syllables, but heavier than years of silence. Slowly, she lifted her chin, her gaze meeting the lens. For a split second, she saw her reflection in the glass, the faint outline of a woman who had survived. The shutter clicked. The sound startled her, and she flinched, but the man smiled. A few moments later, he pulled a thin square from the camera, a photograph, still developing. The women leaned forward, whispering. The image emerged slowly, shapes forming like ghosts returning from memory. There she was, the nurse, dirt on her hands, hair tangled, uniform faded, but alive. Her eyes, though tired, carried something unfamiliar. Not fear, not submission, something almost peaceful. She stared at the picture as though seeing a stranger who resembled her but was freer. The other women gathered around, touching the photograph as if it were sacred. "You look different," one whispered. "You look strong," another said. "You look happy." The nurse didn't know how to answer. She didn't feel strong or happy, just awake. The photographer left the photo with her. That night, she kept it under her pillow, afraid someone might take it away.